non-American taxpayers with a focus on middle-class families. Today's markup is the culmination of a years-long tax reform effort. On this committee, both parties have been engaged in this endeavor, which has included the work of multiple chairmen from both sides of the aisle. And almost every member of our former, almost every member has participated in this process. Our former chairman, Senator Max Baucus, was very much engaged in this effort, as was his counterpart on the Republican side, another former chairman, Senator Grassley. Our ranking member, Senator Wyden, has also done a great deal of work in this effort, both as previous chairman of the committee and as a longtime committee member. Others who have served on this committee, and most of those who are now on the committee, have done a great deal of work to advance tax reform. I want to thank all of my colleagues for their work over the years to get us to this point. I have more to say about members' individual contributions in the coming days. For now, I'd like to take a few moments to talk about some of the highlights in the bill that will be before us today and this week. First and foremost, this legislation will provide much-needed tax relief to American workers and families. It reduces rates across the board, particularly for those in the middle class who have struggled to get through the past 8 years of economic stagnation. It provides substantial benefits for parents and families and preserves a number of key elements of our existing tax code. The bill modifies the bracket schedule, setting up seven separate tax brackets, the lowest at 10% and the highest at 38.5%. There's also an expanded zero tax bracket, meaning more families will see their tax liability eliminated entirely. While the unified framework that congressional and administrative leaders released last month envisioned fewer rate brackets, we found that the additional brackets help us to better target tax relief to lower-income Americans and to the middle class. However, even with the additional brackets, the system will be much simpler for the vast majority of taxpayers because the bill nearly doubles the standard deduction up to $12,000 for individuals, $24,000 for married couples, and $18,000 for single parents. This, as I just mentioned, effectively expands the zero tax bracket and reduces the tax burden for millions of families, removing entirely the tax liability for many others and eliminating their need to itemize deductions. According to projections, more than 90% of taxpayers will use the standard deduction under this plan. In contrast to that's in contrast to around 70% today, which makes the process of computing and filing one's taxes a much simpler proposition. The bill also expands the child tax credit from $1,000 to $1,650 and substantially lifts existing income caps on the credit, allowing many more parents to claim the credit and giving additional tax relief to middle-class families. Let me give a couple of examples of how this will help. Under our bill, a family of four making the U.S. median family income of around $73,000 a year will see their federal income taxes reduced by more than 40%. In specific dollar terms, that's a reduction of nearly $1,500 for a single year. That's about $125 more take-home pay for every month for a single parent making $41,000 a year. They'll receive a tax cut of more than $1,000, which cuts their overall tax liability by a little more than half. That's real money that will help tens of millions of American families make ends meet, save for the future, or simply improve their quality of life. Our bill also preserves the mortgage interest deduction and the deduction for charitable contributions. Those are two really important provisions that many support and want to keep in place. We've also gotten a number of letters and heard statements from many of our Democratic colleagues urging us to maintain a number of other provisions in the current code. For example, I received a letter last week signed by 16 Senate Democrats urging us to, quote, protect existing tax incentives that promote retirement savings among American workers, unquote. Our bill, in accord with the urging of these colleagues, Democrat colleagues, keeps the most popular retirement savings programs, 401ks, and individual retirement accounts fully in place. Others have weighed in on things like the adoption tax credit or the deduction for medical expenses, both of which are unchanged in this legislation. And we've gotten word from colleagues about their desire to keep the earned income tax credit where it is. Our bill protects that provision as well. Thus far, I've only mentioned the individual reforms in the bill, but if you look at the policies I've mentioned, you should notice that they represent ideas that both Republicans and Democrats tend to support. In fact, our ranking member introduced legislation a few years back that would have significantly brought down individual rates across the board in a fashion similar to the approach outlined in our framework. I might add, and nearly tripled the standard deduction. It would have also repealed the alternative minimum tax, as would the bill we're debating today. In those and other respects, that previous legislation is pretty similar to ours. On the business side, our bill will permanently lower the corporate tax rate to 20%. The current 25% corporate tax rate is the highest in the industrialized world. Actually, it's 35% corporate tax rate. That's the highest in the industrialized world. This is a drag on our economy, and one of the few factors continually chasing companies and economic activity offshore. If this idea sounds familiar, it should. Members of both parties for years now have called for lowering the corporate tax rate, recognizing that by being so out of step with the rest of the industrialized world, we put American companies, the workers they employ, and the customers they serve at a major disadvantage. For example, in this legislation, with former Senator Coates, Senator Wyden proposed reducing the corporate tax rate to 24%. 2 years ago, our bipartisan working group on business tax, co-chaired by Senators Cardin and Thune, said that business taxes should be lower. In fact, that recommendation was the first principle of business tax reform listed in their report to the committee and the Senate as a whole. President Obama, in one of his later budgets, proposed reducing corporate tax rates to as low as 25% for certain sectors. And last year, President Bill Clinton, even as his wife's presidential campaign was calling for an increase in corporate taxes, said that we should lower our corporate rates. He wanted to lower them to be more on a par with our foreign competitors. We placed the rate at 20% in our bill, which is slightly below the current average of OECD countries. Our bill also lowers the burden on small businesses through a fairly unique approach. For pass-through businesses whose income is taxed on individual returns, our bill provides a simple tax deduction for qualified business income, leaving regular compensation to be taxed at the individual rates. The mechanism involved uses existing provisions of the tax code, which businesses are accustomed to dealing with and have a large body of precedent behind them. The mechanism provides from policing against anyone thinking about mischaracterization of one form of income as another in order to unduly lower their tax bill. Our legislation also expands the availability of cash accounting in order to allow more businesses to simplify their accounting methods. It expands Section 179 expensing for small businesses in order to help owners invest and expand their businesses so they can increase productivity and hire more workers. The bill also provides businesses with full and immediate expensing for new equipment. again, to enhance productivity, create jobs, and grow wages for American workers. Finally, the bill modernizes our archaic international tax system, moving us more toward a territorial tax system. Our current worldwide system is another element of our tax code that chases jobs, economic activity, and investment out of the United States. Under this legislation, American multinationals will be able to bring funds from their foreign subsidiaries back into the U.S. without facing tax liability. That means an end to the, quote, lockout effect, unquote, which in turn means more investment, production, and economic growth right here in America, which, of course, translates into more jobs and better wages for taxpayers. To provide safeguards, our bill also includes provisions to prevent earnings stripping and other practices that erode our tax base. This is another area where both parties tend to agree. In 2015, for example, a bipartisan working group on international tax reform, which was co-chaired by Senator Portman and the current Senate Minority Leader, assessed the problems with the current international tax system and recommended changes entirely consistent with the ones that we're proposing today in this legislation. Long story short, our proposed international reforms are not just a Republican wish list or some sort of favor to big companies. They are, in fact, well within the bipartisan mainstream. All told, the business tax proposals in our bill are designed to grow our economy, increase wages, promote the expansion of businesses, and of course create jobs. These sections of our bill will modernize our business tax system, finally updating it for the 21st century. Thus far, I've only gone over some of the highlights of the bill. There's more about the bill to discuss, which we'll get to throughout the course of this markup. However, before I conclude, I do want to respond in advance to some of the claims we're certain to hear this week about this legislation. There are a number of myths being spread about this bill and what we intend to accomplish. I want to put some of those to bed right now. For example, I'm quite certain we'll hear a lot about supposed process fouls here today. We'll hear that we're rushing it and rushing the bill through the committee, and that we haven't had enough hearings. We'll also likely hear about bills drafted in secret and Democrats being shut out of the process. Well, let me set the record straight on these points. Under no objective standard is this bill being rushed or forced through. This committee, or through either congressional chamber, as I noted earlier, this committee's efforts on tax reform go back years. Let me outline some of the work we've done to lay the groundwork just since I became lead Republican on the committee in 2011. In that time span, just short of 7 years, we've held about 70 tax hearings, most of which included in-depth discussions on ways to improve our code. In the first year, I was joined by all the Republicans on the committee in submitting 21 pages of tax reform recommendations to the so-called super committee. This was the start of laying the groundwork. Chairman Baucus and I, as part of our, quote, blank slate, unquote, approach in 2013, produced 10 separate bipartisan options papers discussing concrete policy solutions to fixing our tax code. At the end of 2014, I released an extensive report more than 300 pages long, discussing in some detail ideas and principles to be considered during the tax reform debate. The following year, Senator Wyden and I oversaw the creation of 5 separate bipartisan working groups, all of whom produced reports which provided the foundation for even more hearings. In other words, we've discussed all of these topics at length. We'll also be walking through the bill as part of this markup. There is quite simply no reasonable basis to claim that more hearings, more discussion, and more deliberation have to take place before we can move forward. Virtually every proposal contained in this bill has been the subject of public debate for many years, working with colleagues in Congress and the administration, and after close consultation with committee members, we put together this chairman's mark. There's nothing unusual about this process except that with other matters, we don't usually spend so many years of study and discussion before putting more concrete proposals together. Furthermore, I have personally invited Democrats to participate in this process on a number of occasions, both publicly and privately. I've sat in on our committee in front of cameras and microphones and asked colleagues to come to the table with objective minds and without preconditions. Our friends on the other side decided it was in their best interest to put some fairly strict preconditions on their involvement. Some of those preconditions did shift a bit over time, like the later retracted specious demand that President Trump release his tax returns before Democrats would come to the table, an ultimatum made by key members of the Senate Democratic leadership. But one precondition that never went away and was shared by almost every Democrat in the Senate was a demand that Republicans swear off the use of budget reconciliation before any real bipartisan discussions take place. 45 Democrats signed a letter in August stating that the public abandonment of budget reconciliation was, in their words, a, quote, prerequisite to any bipartisan tax reform effort, unquote. Essentially, our colleagues demanded that we empower them to kill any potential tax reform bill before they'd even begin talks. That's not the kind of statement one usually hears from someone who wants to work in good faith toward shared goals. It's also at odds with the history of the Senate. Over the years, the Senate has moved many tax bills through reconciliation, and in almost all cases, the bills ended up getting votes from both parties. Reconciliation in no way precludes the possibility of bipartisanship, and Republicans were prepared to follow a similar route with this particular process, as was followed in previous tax bills and budget bills. So just everyone is clear, it was the Democrats' own preconditions that kept them from engaging on tax reform. There was an open seat at the negotiating table. They collectively chose not to sit in it. Another claim I expect to hear is that our bill is a massive tax cut for the so-called rich. That's always the claim of Democrats. This claim, of course, is false. Under the bill, the top rate will go down by roughly 1 percentage point, but the bill repeats a number of tax credits and deductions, many of which disproportionately benefit the wealthy, meaning that the slightly lower rates will apply to a larger base of income. The Joint Committee on Taxation produced a distribution table that clarifies a number of key points, including the fact that Americans in all income categories will receive a tax break under our bill, with the middle class getting a larger percentage of the reductions. The Joint Committee on Taxation also found that our bill will not shift the tax burden from the high end onto taxpayers down in lower brackets. In fact, according to JCT, those with incomes of $1 million a year or more will see their share of the overall tax burden go up. So while the bill lowers rates across the board, it actually increases the share of taxes paid by those earning $1 million or more in annual income. Let me just say that again. Our bill increases the share of the overall tax burden paid by millionaires and billionaires. Let me address another JCT analysis that includes more good news. Some of my colleagues have latched onto a JCT table showing that some percentages of taxpayers in the individual cohorts will see their taxes go up under the bill. I believe the talking point is that 13 million families in the middle class will see their taxes go up next year if the bill becomes law. Now let's set aside the fact that it is virtually impossible to create a tax plan that will impact every taxpayer the same way. And let's assume for the sake of argument that my colleagues' estimates, which include virtually no context, are correct. Even then, the critics of our bill are missing the forest for the trees. They would have the American people believe that the real story is that a relatively small minority of taxpayers could see a slight increase in their taxes, with the biggest proportion of overall increases going to upper middle class taxpayers. But to do that, they have to obfuscate the fact that under that same JCT analysis, about 90% of those same middle class taxpayers are getting a tax cut. At the very least, are held harmless under our plan. I know my colleagues prefer to label any Republican tax proposal as a massive tax cut for the rich, but that is not the case here. Our bill is primarily focused on tax relief for middle and lower income taxpayers. And the analysis by our nonpartisan congressional scorekeeper has confirmed that the legislation we've crafted accomplishes that goal. I'm sure we'll also hear more about tax breaks for big corporations under the bill, yet I would think that anyone who has previously gone on record in support of lowering the corporate tax rate will refrain from attacking this bill for doing just that. Of course, I won't hold my breath on that. But if that simple baseline of intellectual honesty were to be observed in this markup, most of the Democrats in this committee would be unable to criticize our effort to lower corporate rates, as most of them have endorsed a similar approach in the recent past. And I'm sure we'll also hear about the death tax today, but I hope that with that discussion we'll get an explanation from some of our Democrat colleagues, including my friend, the ranking member, why they are so critical of our efforts to simply mitigate the impact of the death tax when they voted in the past to repeal the tax entirely. I also hope they'll have an explanation for America's farmers and businesses for why their deaths should be considered a taxable event when they choose to pass their life's work, which has already been taxed at least once already, to the next generation. Another matter that we'll likely hear about this week is the state and local tax deduction. I'm sure a number of our Democratic colleagues will argue that the deduction is an absolute necessity. I plan to ask them why they want to forego middle-class tax relief in order to preserve a tax deduction that overwhelmingly benefits the taxpayers at the very high end of the income spectrum, particularly after they've been publicly lamenting the very idea of cutting taxes for the so-called rich. I could go on here, but I think my overall point is pretty clear. So far, we've heard a number of attacks on our tax reform bill that just can't withstand much objective scrutiny. But once again, objectivity isn't really in order these days. At this point, one thing should be clear. Our goal with this effort is to provide tax relief and bigger paychecks to low and middle income families and to make America a better place to start and grow a business. There are many in the middle class who have felt left behind in the sluggish economy under the previous administration. And they feel that they are not being heard. We have an opportunity this week to show that we are listening, that we will act to get the economy moving again, to provide better wages, more jobs, and new opportunities for individuals and families in America. We can act by reforming our broken tax code in a manner that will provide a growing economy for the benefit of all Americans and tax relief targeted toward the middle class. I want to once again thank all of my colleagues for their work to get us this far. I have more to say about their individual efforts in the coming days. But before I conclude, I do want to note something that a few observers have recognized, namely that the mark, as originally introduced, leaves us with some work to do in order to make the reforms permanent, particularly on the business side, where job creators need to be able to plan many years into the future. We are, of course, aware of this problem and are working to ensure that the reduced rates and additional reforms designed to bring investment back to the United States and are designed to bring investment back to the United States and create more American jobs. that these jobs will remain in place past the 10-year budget window. There's no real cause for concern at this point, but I do want to make clear that we're looking at a number of alternatives that will fill the necessary gaps. And we have every intention of making the business reforms permanent. Now with that, I'll turn to my good friend and colleague, Senator Wyden, the ranking member, for his opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman and colleagues, what started out as a promise of a significant middle-class tax cut has become a multi-trillion-dollar bait and switch, a massive handout to multinational corporations, and a bonanza for tax cheats and powerful political donors. For millions in the middle class, this will not be a tax cut at all. It will be a tax increase. So while corporations are celebrating being lavished with a holiday gift of trillions of dollars in tax cuts, middle-class families will have to hope they're lucky enough to avoid a tax hike they certainly can't afford. The fact is, there is a massive gap between the Republican rhetoric surrounding this bill and the reality of what is on paper. The rhetoric has made this bill out to be lasting and substantial tax relief for everybody in the middle class. The reality is, it is neither lasting nor substantial. So in the last few days, the baseless talking point about an across-the-board guaranteed tax cut has been weighed down with a whole bunch of Washington lingo. The new line is, this bill has always been about cutting taxes on average across a variety of income levels. Anybody who's had a bad experience with a used car dealer ought to recognize that that kind of careful hedging is usually covering up one nasty surprise. Now, for the middle class, the bill goes wrong right out of the gate by eliminating the state and local tax deduction. State and local taxes are how communities pay for firefighters, how they pay for police and schools and roads and bridges. Americans get to deduct those taxes because of a long-standing principle that says the government shouldn't reach into their pockets twice to double tax the same earnings. The bill Republicans have on offer throws that principle in the trash can. Now, some Republican lawmakers and supporters of this bill want to say this is just a red versus blue issue, as if it is okay to knowingly harm people just because they take a different view of policy. But the red versus blue justification simply does not hold up to the facts. It is not just Oregon, California, and the Northeast that are going to take a hit if the state and local deduction goes away. It's also going to be millions of people in Wisconsin and Arizona, Georgia, the Carolinas, and a lot of places across the country that pulled the lever for Republicans last November. This proposal specifically targets communities where the American dream has sparked economic growth and created opportunity and helped more and more people become middle class. So eliminating the state and local deduction isn't about smart economic policy. In fact, it is sure to leave many communities worse off. Now, Republicans didn't have to go down this road, but because they insisted since day one that they ought to use the most partisan process in Washington, known as reconciliation, they've got to squeeze several $1 trillion of tax handouts and corporate goodies into a $1.5 trillion box. That means telling the middle class in America to pay up. At its core, this plan perpetuates what is most rotten and unfair about the American tax system. The reality is there are two tax systems in America. There's one for the cop on the beat and the nurse in the emergency room. For them, the system is strict, it's compulsory, and their taxes come straight out of every single paycheck. Then there's another set of rules for the powerful, the well-connected, and the multinational corporations that have armies of tax lawyers and accountants. Those folks can pretty much pay what they want when they want to. The proposal before the committee does nothing to fix that imbalance. In fact, it worsens the division and enshrines the sources of unfairness that leave so many hardworking Americans feel they've been kicked in the gut around April 15th. Americans are sick of watching corporations ship jobs overseas, abuse unfair loopholes, and shift their profits to fake headquarters on zero-tax islands. But this bill essentially tells those corporations, you have been putting in lots of work chasing a rock-bottom tax rate, so let's go ahead and move the starting line even closer to zero. Even worse, the massive giveaway is just one part of the story when it comes to the multinational corporation side of this bill. Under this Republican plan, multinational corporations will get an even bigger reward for doing business overseas than they'll get for creating red, white, and blue jobs here at home. Imagine, colleagues, how that's going to sound to the residents of forgotten mill towns or cities where the main street is boarded up and the factory lights don't come on anymore. There are too many Americans who've lost jobs that paid middle-class wages and had to scrape together work wherever they could get it just to make ends meet. They are tired of watching the same pattern over and over again. And those who've waited decades for a meaningful raise deserve better than to see corporations reward than to see Congress reward corporations that flee the United States. It shouldn't come as a big surprise that the ideas I've described are a tough sell. But in another return to the old playbook, the administration and Republicans have cracked out trickle-down fantasy math to justify these corporate handouts. They're making big promises about record wage increases, the economy kicking into high gear, the tax cuts paying for themselves. But there is no trustworthy, independent analysis or historical record to back up those claims. Treasury Secretary Mnuchin even claimed that the tax handouts wouldn't just pay for themselves, they'd raise an additional $1 trillion on top of their cost. How he came to that conclusion remains a mystery. I'll tell you, it sure sounds like a lot of hocus-pocus arithmetic. The Treasury Secretary also scrubbed from his department's website a recent analysis that said corporate shareholders, not workers, are the overwhelming beneficiaries of tax cuts. And if you're tired of the political back and forth on this one, you don't need to listen to lawmakers. Listen to the corporate heads themselves who are talking about the investor calls they're making. They're already previewing plans to turn their tax handouts into stock buybacks and other shareholder goodies. Not the new jobs, not the big wage increases Republicans have been promising. And you don't have to take my word for it. Look at what the corporations are saying on those investor calls. So the millions of Americans who face a tax hike directly caused by this bill will only be its first victims. The hardworking people whose jobs are sent abroad because of this bill are going to become victims later on as well. And now I'm going to turn to the threat of exploding deficits. I'd wager that the Republican deficit hawks who seemed to fly away when this $1.5 trillion bill was proposed are going to come flying back once it's enacted and the deficits pile up. Members of the administration and top Republicans in Congress have already said that, quote, entitlement reform is going to be up after taxes. Folks, let's be clear. That is Washington speak for going after Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security. And it's an old game plan. Run up a big federal deficit and then insist that there's no choice but to force draconian cuts to the social safety net. And as Americans, we have seen this movie before. The first big legislative push after the Bush tax cuts was an attack on Social Security. Fortunately, it was stopped. Might be a lot harder this time. If those cuts to our safety net programs happen, you can add seniors and many of America's most vulnerable to the list of victims of the bill. Now I want to close with a comment on the process, which I consider to be a farce. And I was struck by the chairman saying that Democrats could have been at the finance tax table. Colleagues, let's be clear. Nobody on this side even knew where the finance tax table was. We weren't invited. We never knew where it was. Now, I see some in the majority now saying that they're faced with a choice between this unpopular tax bill and looking like they won't be able to govern. I want to be clear. I don't think those are the only options on the table. They sure weren't the only options when Ronald Reagan and a big group of Democrats came together to pass tax reform. Talked to Bill Bradley about it, one of our former colleagues. Best jump shot in the history of the Senate Finance Committee. And I'll tell you, they weren't the only options. Looking at an unpopular tax bill or saying you can't govern. When I got together with two respected senior Republican senators, Judd Gregg and Dan Coates, now a member of the president's cabinet. So there's still an opportunity to work on a bipartisan basis. Just the way Ronald Reagan did. Means sitting down and spending the necessary time to make sure by getting ideas from both sides that you haven't hurt the middle class. It means Democrats and Republicans talking together instead of relying on partisan trickery to speed a secretive bill to completion before anybody really catches on. Nobody has got to wave the white flag of surrender and just pass a partisan process and a partisan bill in order to avoid an unpopular bill. Now, twice I've had a chance to talk with Democratic senators and administration officials. Both times, my Democratic colleagues and I made clear that we agree with Republicans that the tax code is a rotten broken mess. We expressed our desire for bipartisan reform, and we made it clear, as we have now for months, that we want to work with Republicans to do tax reform done right. The message we delivered was that real bipartisan, Reagan-style tax reform could pass with 70 or 80 votes, maybe even more. It could make the tax code a whole lot more fair, put money back in the pockets of middle-class families, and bring on a wave of new red, white, and blue jobs. Even before those meetings, Democrats shared with Republicans our principles for reform: a focus on the middle class, a focus on fiscal responsibility, and a focus on protecting Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Twice, colleagues, in recent weeks, the president has said he's for those principles. But the fact is, those principles have not been written down by the Congress on paper. What's on offer is a rejection of the bipartisan approach. The bill before the committee has been in the public view less than 4 days. It came out, in fact, just as Veterans Day celebrations were kicking off. This weekend, while I was marching in a parade in Albany, Oregon, I looked for places to make a few quiet calls to Washington to get the latest details. And I'm sure my colleagues were in the same boat. There has not been, nor will there be, based on the process at this point, a single hearing on the details of this proposal. Now, I'm sure somebody's going to say the committee can have a full debate right now, that this is our opportunity to hash out our differences and work on tax reform. But let's be clear, that is not the way Ronald Reagan did it. That is not what they did when they spent months with top Reagan officials going back and forth with Democrats like Bill Bradley to talk about specifics, talk about detailed provisions to make sure particularly the middle class and small businesses wouldn't get hurt, and that they pass a bipartisan bill that would give everybody a chance to get ahead. What's going on now in the Senate Finance Committee is an abandonment of the Reagan-style tax reform process. The first votes are just around the corner, and this bill is going to go through a lot of contortions in the days ahead. But I think we ought to be clear that as of now, the contortions are going to be about the same bottom line: getting the biggest possible corporate handout on a strictly partisan basis through the Senate. The bill has the power to reshape the American economy in ways that will leave a lot of Americans worse off. It is going to raise taxes on millions in the middle class. It will give American multinational corporations more relief for doing business overseas than they get for doing business in our country. I don't believe it's a radical idea to say the committee ought to take the time to consider these consequences before we start voting. There is bipartisan agreement that the tax code is a broken mess, so instead of the partisan process that will force middle-class families to pay up to finance a handout for the multinationals, it is not too late to do this right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. We'll now proceed to member opening statements. And because we are frequently strained for time during our executive sessions, I tend to urge colleagues against making opening statements. However, I think we can all agree that this proceeding is a bit different. As such, I'm quite certain that most members have thoughts they'd like to share before we begin consideration of the mark. So I'm going to recognize members for that purpose and in the appropriate order. Under the committee rules, I want to be flexible, but I ask that individual members limit their remarks to no more than 4 minutes. So we'll begin the remarks of the members of the committee. Senator Grassley?
I want to thank Chairman Hatch and his staff for their tireless work in putting together the chairman's mark. When I do that, I think I speak with some authority on the point that it takes a lot of work to put it together, because I chaired this committee at one time when Chairman Baucus was the ranking member, and we operated under the same reconciliation process as being discouraged at this particular time. And we put together a mark to cut taxes in 2001 and did, and we were able to, through the hard work of my staff and the hard work of Senator Baucus' staff, put together something that got 25% of the Democratic caucus to vote for. So bipartisanship is very much an opportunity under reconciliation. So we now have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to modernize our tax code in a way that will provide significant middle-income tax cuts while making the tax code simpler, fairer, and more pro-growth. At the heart of this legislation is making good on a commitment to enact significant tax cuts for middle-income taxpayers. On average, middle-class families will see their tax bill shrink by nearly $1,500. The child tax credit will increase from $1,000 to $1,650, which will help ease the financial strain for working families. By nearly doubling the standard deduction, many lower-income taxpayers will be removed from the tax rolls entirely. Moreover, the tax filing season will become much more simplified for millions of Americans. Small businesses will also see significant tax cuts from the rate reductions on the individual side, but also from an innovative pass-through business income deduction. This tax relief will incentivize investment back into the business, creating jobs and spurring economic growth. With small businesses responsible for a majority of new jobs, this is a crucial component of the pro-job, pro-growth tax framework. The chairman's mark will also bring our corporate tax structure into the 21st century. Our high corporate tax rate and outdated worldwide tax system has put American companies at a real competitive disadvantage globally, costing American jobs. Our corporate tax system has been strained to its breaking point as we have battled corporate inversions and foreign takeovers. Without action, we can expect this trend not to only persist, but to grow in the coming years. I know my Democratic colleagues have expressed concerns that we're moving too fast, but we have been discussing tax reform for years, and the time for action is right now. The good work on the part of both Republican and Democratic chairmen of this committee past have helped lay the groundwork to get us where we are today. I also understand that our Democratic colleagues have vehemently objected to the use of reconciliation, but past practices of this committee prove reconciliation does not have to be synonymous with partisanship. I know this from experience, and I've already referred to my work with Chairman Baucus and also Ranking Member Baucus. The result of that, we passed reconciliation legislation out of this committee with strong bipartisan support by a vote of 13-5. So there is no reason for this to have to be a partisan process today. I yield.
Senator Cantwell?
Mr. Chairman, I'll try to do my best, but this is pretty important legislation. First, I want to say I don't agree with many of the president's economic strategies. I don't believe in his notion of fear and isolationism. I don't believe in his notion of discussing things that are going to start trade wars. I don't believe in his lack of support for a functioning export-import bank that will help U.S. manufacturers build products and seek homes and find their acceptance in international markets. I don't support his notion that the FERC ought to mandate that consumers in Ohio or Pennsylvania or Kentucky pay higher electricity rates by forcing them to adhere to purchasing coal because he wants to bring coal back. And I don't support his notions of cutting innovation and R&D in various sectors of our economy. I sure don't think you have to apply the same kind of FERC logic on coal to oil and say that the only way that Amazon or Microsoft can get a tax break is if we destroy the great wilderness of the Arctic Wildlife Refuge. So, no, I too had high hopes for what would be a discussion about our corporate tax rate, having many companies in my state that have to compete on an international basis. I hoped that we were going to have that discussion, and when my colleagues on the other side of the aisle said it needed to be deficit neutral, I listened. I thought, okay, this is interesting. When they said we are going to close corporate loopholes to pay for a corporate rate reduction, I listened. And I thought, well, maybe this is where we're going to go. We're going to sit down in a collaborative fashion and work together. And Mr. Chairman, you and I do have a good working relationship, but the notion that the president had a meeting of the finance members to come down to the White House and I wasn't invited because I happened to represent a state that he didn't win is a ridiculous idea. So the notion that where we are today, and my main objection, is that instead of doing those things that we talked about on the corporate tax rate, looking at some of these things like carried interest or like-in-kind exchanges or the fact that golf courses get tax breaks, instead, a big chunk of this bill is being paid for on the backs of middle-class families by taking away their deductions. Their local sales tax deduction from a state like mine that doesn't have an income tax, from their property taxes not being able to be deducted, or the mortgage deduction, and I know there's differences between the House and the Senate bill, but this isn't simplification of our tax code. It's simply raising taxes on middle-class families in my state, and it's raising taxes on millions of Americans across the United States to give a break to the corporations. So it's a very different structure than we talked about. Now, most objecting, because Mr. Chairman, you and I have worked very hard on trying to make more affordable housing, but by getting rid of these deductions on property taxes, on home mortgage, the notion that you're getting rid of private activity bonds in the House legislation, and that you're making changes to the low-income tax credit in this Senate bill is just making housing more expensive at a time when we have a record number of Americans who are in unaffordable housing situations. So I look at our challenges, and I know that you or some of our colleagues talked about the small business corporate, small businesses getting, it's so complex. It's so challenging. I don't know what small businesses are going to benefit from this. So, Mr. Chairman, I hope that we can slow down. The reason I mentioned the housing, and I will wrap up, is that housing used to be 15% of GDP. In the few hearings that we did have on this, now it's only 12% of GDP. This bill, I know you think this notion of returning investment from overseas, not a bad idea, something we could talk about, but we are just returning it, and it's going to go into the dividend pool. There's nothing in there that says it should go to infrastructure investment. There's nothing in there that says it should go for roads or housing or even job training. And I can guarantee you, it's not worth giving a tax break to corporations if you can't find a qualified workforce or they have to live an hour and a half away because housing is so expensive. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the additional minute. I think 5 is a very good target, and I appreciate it. I hope we'll slow down. I hope we'll have the courage to work together in a regular order process.
Thanks, Senator. Senator Crapo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Everyone here has heard me say many times that if we had tried to, we probably couldn't have created a tax code that is more unfair, more complex, more expensive to comply with, or more anti-competitive to our own American business interests than the code we're working on. And finally, we have an opportunity to move forward with meaningful reform. And once again, the attack is made that it's just an effort to try to raise taxes on the wealthy, on the poor or the middle class, and cut taxes for the wealthy. Rhetoric is flying all over the place. Well, let's just look at some of the facts. We all have in front of us, or should, the distributional charts that have been put out by our own tax writers and assistants. The Joint Tax Committee's distributional reports show that taxes will go down. The amount of taxes in dollars will go down for every single income category in America. And if you look at these distributional charts, you will see that the largest percentages of reduction are in the lower and middle class income categories. The same charts also show that the average tax rate will go down for every single income category in America. And once again, a greater percentage of reduction for those in the lower to middle income categories. Yet we will continue to face the attacks that what we are doing is trying to raise taxes for those in the middle and lower income categories so that we can feather the nest of the wealthy. The opposite is the case. If our tax reform can save millions of additional lower and middle income families from having to save their receipts and dig them up again each year at tax time, don't tell them that's not a meaningful benefit. If the simplification of our tax code can further save those lower and middle income families from the need to pay potentially hundreds of dollars a year for someone else to prepare their tax returns because the code is so complex, don't tell them that's not a benefit. If every single member of every single bracket of income earners in America gets a tax reduction, and the biggest percentage of tax reduction goes to those in the middle and lower income categories, don't tell them that we're raising their taxes. If pro-growth effects of making American business more competitive around the world can result in higher wages and more job opportunities for lower and middle income families, don't tell them that we are feathering the nest of the wealthy. The reality is we are going to address the true problems with our tax code, and it is going to help all Americans have a stronger, healthy America, a stronger family, stronger wages, better growth, and an ability to start building ourselves out of our fiscal crisis. There's another very important effect of comprehensive reform that we've got to fully explore. Some have suggested that our current fiscal situation means it would be irresponsible to do any kind of tax reform that increases the deficit on a static or current law basis. Actually, the opposite is the case. This is precisely the time we need to focus on the dynamic opportunities for growth in our economy. On our current path, and our own CBO analysts have told us, if we don't change our course, we will see our rate of growth in this economy stay at its stagnant level of below 2%. And other analysts have said that if we will take a dynamic approach to fixing this broken tax code and making ourselves more competitive, we will see rates of growth that could significantly increase. Again, helping not just individuals and families, but helping this nation become much more competitive economically. I see that my time is running out. I had some charts and some analysis here to go through. I guess I'll do it at another time when we have an opportunity to discuss it. But Mr. President, it's time to fix our code. We no longer need America to have the most complex, the most expensive, and the most anti-competitive code in the world, and one that pushes down our own citizens' ability to grow and achieve their American dream.
Yeah. Thank you, Senator. Senator Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity to make an opening statement. When I left Washington last Thursday, hardly anyone had seen the Republican tax plan. And one holiday weekend later, we are now here marking up the most consequential tax policy in 31 years, with no hearings, not a single hearing on the legislation. Mr. Chairman, America needs tax reform. I joined the Finance Committee because I believe that. We haven't reformed our tax code since I was in college with a Smith Corona typewriter. Our economy has transformed since then, but our tax code remains frozen in the past. We should clean up special interest loopholes. We should help our businesses compete in a global economy. We need comprehensive and bipartisan reform. But in a break with the tradition, the committee has made no serious attempt to bring both sides together. Instead, the majority wrote a deeply flawed proposal that adds $1.5 trillion to our debt. In 2014, a Republican member of this committee wrote, quote, "It doesn't take a mathematician to see we are sitting on a ticking time bomb of debt." Another said, "Our nation's growing debt is costing us jobs and economic growth today, and it is an unfair burden to pass on to our children and grandchildren." I agree, and I think it's important in this context to review how we arrived at this point. In 2000, President Clinton left a $5.6 trillion projected surplus to his successor. At that time, Congress held hearings about how to invest in our future and pay down our debt. Some members of the Senate were here for that. Then President Bush, on the same arguments that we're hearing today, signed two major tax cuts, one of which was after we invaded Iraq, and prosecuted two wars without paying for them. Then he signed Medicare Part D without paying for that. A number of people voted with President Bush on all of those steps who are still here today. When President Obama came to office in 2009, he inherited a collapsing economy and a $1.2 trillion annual deficit. Then, amidst the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, a lot of Republican leaders all of a sudden remembered their fiscal conservatism, citing the debt. Nearly all of them opposed the economic recovery package to stabilize our economy and save millions from unemployment. Over the next 8 years, despite bipartisan efforts to rein in the debt, leadership consistently rejected a balanced approach. And as a result, rather than confront our fiscal challenges, Washington has taken the easy path by cutting investments in our future, in education, research, innovation, and infrastructure, while at the same time burdening our future with trillions more in debt. This should seem deeply unfair to Americans in their 20s and younger, to know that we are investing less in them than our parents and grandparents invested in us. And then we have the nerve to say, you need to pay back the debt that we accrued investing in ourselves. For years, Republican members of this committee have raised alarms about our debt. I believe they are sincere, but I struggle to comprehend how they can square that view and support this plan. As our debt grows, we will spend billions more, not on schools, roads, or innovation, but on interest costs. And we're about to blow another hole in the debt without helping the middle class, which is what makes it even worse. By 2019, the Senate plan would actually raise taxes on 19.4 million households earning under $200,000, while providing no benefit to nearly 54 million households. On top of that, we know that when deficits swell, as they surely will, cuts to Medicaid and Medicare are sure to follow, further burdening working families struggling to make ends meet. That is not what the American people want. We need to stop this and write a bill that's worthy of this committee. Mr. Chairman, thank you for allowing me to take a few additional seconds.
Thank you, Senator Bennett. Senator Roberts.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership and your perseverance and your patience in laying down this mark, and for the staff as well. It is abundantly clear that the complexity and the antiquated corporate tax system act as a brake on our economy. This directly affects the jobs and well-being of all Americans. We now have before us a comprehensive plan to address these issues, cleaning up and modernizing the tax code to help generate more growth. The bill before us does exactly that, providing meaningful tax relief for families and small businesses. I am especially pleased with the rates the legislation would put into place on the individual side. We have done a good job pushing these rate reductions down to lower and middle-income families. This would provide a net tax cut for families in Kansas of about $2,500. We accomplished this by reducing individual tax rates, raising the standard deduction, and increasing the child credits in the tax code. I want to turn to agriculture. I am pleased that the Chairman's mark reflects the importance of production agriculture to our economy. The agriculture industry has a number of provisions in the tax code that recognize the uncertain and volatile nature of the income and expense associated with farming operations. Farmers and ranchers have no control over the weather and face highly unpredictable markets. That is certainly true today. This is the third year of depressed prices and tighter credit. And they also face another critical and linked issue, uncertainty in trade policy, a policy that is still very much a work in progress within the administration. I am happy to say that this chairman's mark keeps the ag tax provisions, but will also help our farmers by creating a much more pro-growth tax system, lowering the tax burden, and simplifying the tax provisions relating to our ag sector. For the average farmer in Kansas, the rate reductions, more robust depreciation rules, and the new structure for pass-through entities will enable that farmer to put significantly more dollars in his or her bank account, money which can be used to build their businesses, enabling them to meet the challenges of not only feeding America, but a troubled and hungry world. This legislation also transitions our current international tax system to a territorial system. This is particularly important step because it will address concerns I have long had with the international competitiveness of our corporate tax reform. I have real concerns that the current archaic international system has made our homegrown companies targets for takeovers by foreign competitors, leading to job loss, not to mention a drain on our federal treasury. Now, is this a perfect bill? By no means. But it is a very good bill that I firmly believe will lead to more economic growth. Mr. Chairman, through the process you have laid out, we can improve this good bill to make it the very best bill under very difficult and partisan circumstances. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Senator. I'll go to Senator Cornyn at this time.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the excellent job you've done spearheading this effort. It's the culmination of years, as you point out, years of work by the committee, including 70 hearings on how the tax code can be improved and streamlined to work better for taxpayers. We can also recall the 10 option papers that were issued as part of the blank slate approach launched in 2013 to scrub the tax code and produce policy solutions to modernize it. Many of us expressed, including here today, outrage at the use of reconciliation to provide tax relief to millions of Americans. But this process argument should not be a reason why bipartisan support shouldn't be reached or cannot be reached. In fact, the last 15 reconciliation bills that were signed into law, of those 15, 12 of them had bipartisan support in the Senate for final passage of the conference report. And when I hear our Democratic colleagues say that they weren't included in the process, that was their choice. They simply walked off the field. They're really just complaining about the fact they can't take their ball with them. In many ways, though, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is already a bipartisan bill, at least in some of its most significant aspects. Democrats say they want tax relief too. Former President Barack Obama, the minority leader, and a number of members of this committee have also repeatedly called for lowering the corporate tax rate in order to make our goods more and businesses more competitive in a global economy. Now the ranking member, in effect, calls it a handout. This bill does lower the corporate rate, as Barack Obama and Chuck Schumer and others have called for in the past. And the ranking member has on a number of occasions highlighted his bipartisan reform plan, which proposes to increase the standard deduction for millions of taxpayers. Well, this bill does that. And there's also room for further agreement. If our friends across the aisle want to quit complaining and would like to join us in helping middle-income Americans pay their bills and save for retirement, we would invite them to do so. This is that opportunity. They should join our tax reform efforts and help Americans keep more of the money they earn in their pocket so they can spend it the way they see fit. Finally, this legislation includes a number of common sense proposals that will simplify the tax code, reduce complexity, and make the system fairer. We like these ideas because, as our colleagues have suggested, these provisions will enable us to lower tax burdens on small businesses and working families who deserve a fair shake in the tax system. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Senator Portman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Look, this is an exciting opportunity because our tax code is so broken. And I've heard from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, and they all seem to say the same thing, which is this is a mess. This tax code, which hasn't been reformed in any substantial way in 31 years, is desperately in need of an overhaul. And they also support middle-class tax cuts, which is exactly what's going on here. So we should try to work together. Look, I remember the working group that I co-chaired. I remember sitting in on a lot of those 70 hearings we talked about. We had 5 working groups, by the way, and they were all bipartisan. The working group that I co-chaired was on international, and we basically said 2 things. One, we've got to lower the business rate so that it is not the highest rate in the world, because until we do that, you're going to continue to see jobs and investment go overseas. And we said we've got to switch to an international system that keeps us up with the rest of the world so that we can be competitive, and that means that our workers aren't competing with one hand tied behind their back. That's what this does. Now, there might be some specifics where we have some disagreements, but I got to tell you, this has never been partisan before. It was part of the Simpson-Bowles Commission. They recommended the same thing. And so my hope is that on these proposals, we can achieve a level of bipartisanship, and we can actually get this done because it is so needed, so critical. By the way, back in 1986, last time we reformed this tax code, Pete Rose was still playing for the Cincinnati Reds. That's how long ago it was. When we did the international side, it was back in the 60s. The international code could qualify for AARP benefits. It's that old. So we need this desperately. I heard a lot of talk today about middle-class tax cuts not being in this proposal. I got to tell you, they're here, and that's what all the analysis says. In Ohio, we're going to see a cut for middle-class families. They're going to see tax relief that's significant. We are told that the median family income family in Ohio is going to see a tax cut of about $2,400 a year. I was asked in the hall by some reporters, well, why is that meaningful? It's meaningful because a lot of people I represent are living paycheck to paycheck. This will help with that car payment. This will help maybe save a little for vacation, maybe save a little for retirement. So it's really important. And my Democratic colleagues have claimed that somehow that's not real tax relief. Let me say that nationally, the number is about $1,500. That's a 40% cut in people's taxes. For the single parent, income of about $41,000, median income, it's about a 55% reduction in their income tax, their federal income tax. That's significant. So it's in here. But don't believe me. I know everybody believes the media, so let's see what Politico has to say. Middle class, biggest winners in Senate tax plan, study says. Guess what that study is? The study is from the Nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation. They're here today. They're the ones who do this analysis for us. We don't always agree with them, but boy, they're not partisan, I can tell you that. Here's their distribution tables. We've all got it. They're public now. You can go on jct.gov. Here's one right here. What this shows is that the middle-class tax cuts are real. People were talking earlier about, the firefighter making $50,000 to $75,000 a year. $18 billion tax cut in this package for people between $50,000 and $75,000 a year. Tax rate goes down. Under this proposal, it goes from about 14.8% in tax to an average of about 13.7% in tax. Again, these are the real numbers. Take a look at them. Go online yourself and take a look at them. And you'll see that every single income group in the middle class gets a tax cut. And again, it's meaningful and it is substantial. But let me finally say that I think what's going to be just as meaningful and maybe more meaningful for most of the families I represent is the fact they'll be able to have a better job. And that's why we have to reform and revamp this international system. Outrageous that we currently have jobs and investment going overseas because of our tax code. 4,700 companies, according to a recent study by Ernst & Young, would be American companies today if we'd had this kind of a code in place over the last 13 years. Instead, what are they? They're foreign companies. 3 times as many U.S. companies are being bought by foreign companies as U.S. companies buying them. Why? Because of our tax code. We should be outraged by that. It's our responsibility to fix it. No one else can. And by the way, who gets hurt? American workers. The Congressional Budget Office, another nonpartisan group here, has said that the workers in America have lower wages and lower benefits because of this broken tax code that we've got to fix. That's what this proposal does. And again, it's consistent with efforts that have been in the past bipartisan. So my hope is we can get this done for the people we represent. We can do it in a bipartisan way. I know I have a spirited debate here and on the floor. That's fine. But at the end of the day, let's come together and do something good that actually helps to fix a tax code that everyone acknowledges is broken.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just echo Senator Portman's point, one of his points. It is simply an objective matter of fact that this tax reform will result in a substantial middle-class tax relief. You don't have to take any of our words for it. It's been documented. Joint tax has determined it. It's part of what we solved for. That's just a fact. We're going to lower the burden of taxes on the vast majority of Americans and the overwhelming majority of working class and middle income folks. But that's not all we're doing here. We're also going to make our business tax code finally competitive. And I believe we're fixing exactly what needs to be fixed at this time, Mr. Chairman. You know, let's remember the 8 years of the Obama administration coincided with the worst economic recovery in American history. President Obama got the policies he wanted, massive spending bills they called a stimulus, repeated tax hikes, government virtual takeover of health care, huge unprecedented wave of new regulation. They got what they wanted. And it resulted in extremely feeble growth, in fact, something on the order of 2%. And we were told, just get used to it. This is the new normal. Nothing we can do about it. This is what the American economy does these days. It couldn't be more untrue. Mr. Chairman, there's nothing inevitable about a weak American economy. There is nothing inevitable about a lack of strong growth. We need to fix what's broken, and we can restore the kind of growth and prosperity that we've been waiting for. Well, what was broken in this period, one of the things that was broken, and this is well documented, this is not speculative, this is a matter of objective fact. There was a collapse in the growth of productivity. That was almost certainly caused by a collapse in the growth of the capital stock. Those combined cause a lack of wage gains, and we saw all of this. We're fixing these problems. We're fixing these problems, Mr. Chairman, to a very large degree. On the business side, we're going to lower tax rates. And we're going to allow for immediate full deduction of new capital when it gets put to work. When new plants and equipment are bought, people are going to expense that, be able to expense that immediately. What is that going to do? For one, it's going to allow American workers and business to be competitive and to win in a competitive global economy. And when we encourage and incentivize business to purchase more of the plants and equipment that allows them to grow, we're going to encourage enhancement of productivity. That's how productivity grows. It's when capital gets put to work. And when productivity gains are restored, that's where wage growth comes from. That's what this bill is going to do, Mr. Chairman. And let me say a word about the deficits. Some of my colleagues suggested a great concern about a deficit, which I don't recall at the time when they were passing big stimulus spending bill. But here's a fact. This bill is going to reduce the size of our deficit. If this is enacted into law, we're going to have a smaller deficit, and here's why. The tax reform bill contemplates $1 trillion in foregone revenue relative to the current policy that the federal government is pursuing. So how much extra growth will it take to generate the tax revenue to fill in that hole? And keep in mind what a profound restructuring of the tax code this is. Well, the answer is, according to joint tax, less than 0.4% of economic growth. Now, if you're in the camp that believes it's not possible for America to have strong growth anymore, if that's your camp, then you should be very skeptical about that. I am not in the camp that believes American economic growth is a thing of the past. I think it's entirely possible for us to have economic growth that will exceed by far the 0.4% that it'll take to completely fill in this hole. So, Mr. Chairman, I want to commend you for your work. I'm looking forward to getting this product finished. We are going to lower taxes for middle-income taxpayers. We are going to enact the most pro-growth business reforms in over 30 years. And in the process, we're going to have smaller deficits, and that's going to result in a higher standard of living for the people that we represent. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Senator Timmy. We'll now turn to Senator, let's see, who's next here? Senator Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Tax reform should be about one thing, putting money in the pockets of working people in Ohio and across the country. That's what the President says he wants. That's what I want. That's what most of us in this room want. Unfortunately, that's not what this bill does. Instead, this bill, as the ranking member said, this bill hands $1 trillion to wealthy multinational corporations, some of the same corporations that have sent American jobs overseas. It asks working people to trust that somehow that money will end up increasing their wages. The only problem is it won't work, and it never has. Over the last 40 years, corporate profits have gone up, executive salaries have gone up, GDP has gone up, worker productivity has gone up. Corporations today have record amounts of cash, and the stock market continues to hit record-breaking highs. But what about the wages and the benefits of American workers who created that wealth? They've been flat, and in too many cases, they've declined. If record corporate profits or tax cuts, if record corporate profits have resulted in worker pay raises, why would corporate tax cuts be any different? History shows they won't. We've seen this game before. As the New York Times recently reported, in 2004, multinational corporations peddled a similar bill of goods on Capitol Hill. Give us a tax holiday, we'll bring all those billions of dollars back that we've stashed overseas, we'll bring it back to America, we'll create 500,000 jobs, we'll give workers significant pay increases. Congress, a decade plus ago, bought what they were selling. And in 2005, the Times reports that $299 billion did, in fact, come back from overseas, flowed back into the United States. But the jobs never came. The pay increases never came. Instead, that money went straight into the pockets of corporate executives and corporate board members and shareholders. In fact, according to the Senate's own report, the same corporations that took advantage of the tax holiday actually laid off American workers, exactly the opposite of what they promised. The top 15 corporations alone cut 20,931 American jobs, many of them in my state. At the same time, those companies, again, they promised to bring the money back, to invest, to create jobs, and pay higher wages. At the same time, those companies increased annual compensation for their top 5 executives by 27%. Wall Street got paid, American workers got cheated. Let's not do that again. The solution is pretty simple. You cut out the middleman. Instead of giving money to corporations and hoping some of it trickles down into the pockets of working people, let's just give the money, let's just focus the tax cut on working people. If we want to cut taxes for the middle class, maybe we ought to cut taxes for the middle class. That's how we grow our economy. That's how we create jobs, not through stock buybacks, giving money directly to consumers who will spend it at the gas pump, in the grocery store, in the local mall, and at car dealerships, on family vacations, at local restaurants, at sporting events. That's how you build the economy from the middle out. That's the fundamental difference on this committee from the statements today. You give tax cuts to the rich, it trickles down, and nothing really happens to build the middle class or stimulate the economy. You focus on the middle class, you aim the tax cuts at the middle class, that's how you grow the economy. People like to talk history in this committee. Look at the 1990s, 22 million private sector jobs created during the Clinton years when we focused on the middle class. The 8 Bush years, 0 net job increase. And this committee did 2 big tax cuts for the rich during the Bush years. We have a chance, Mr. Chairman, to work together in a bipartisan way to actually do real good for American workers. The middle ground's obvious. Instead of blindly doling out $1 trillion to multinational corporations who send jobs overseas, count on that with this kind of a tax code and these kinds of tax proposals they are offering. Let's target those companies that actually create good-paying jobs in the United States. That's the Patriot Corporation Act. If you keep jobs in the U.S., if you invest in American workers, if you pay decent wages and benefits, you get a lower tax rate. But if you send jobs overseas, if you take advantage of American workers, you don't get a lower tax rate. By targeting tax cuts toward those corporations who help grow our economy, we save billions of dollars that we put directly in the pockets of American workers by expanding tax cuts for the middle class. Now, corporations, as we know, are beholden to quarterly earning reports, but families don't think of in terms of 3 months earning quarters. Families think in terms of school years, in 30-year mortgages, in how many years until they are prepared for retirement. We need a tax code that does the same, that responds to the needs of working families, not Wall Street. It's not corporations that drive our economy, it's workers, it's consumers, it's the middle class. So give the tax cut directly to workers, to consumers, to the middle class. We've offered, the chairman's comments notwithstanding, we've offered numerous times to work with our Republican colleagues on this committee, and they've put up a sign pretty much saying no thanks. We've offered to work directly with the president. In fact, not long ago, the President of the United States invited all the Republican members of this committee to sit with him in the cabinet room. He invited the ranking member. He sort of thought that would be appropriate. And then he invited 5 other senators, Senator McCaskill, Senator Casey, Senator Nelson, help me here, Senator Stabenow, and me, the 5 of us, and we're not really sure why those 5, but maybe we'll understand it. But during that meeting, I brought up the Patriot Corporation Act. You help the companies that do the right thing, that do what the president wants them to do, pay good wages and keep production in the United States. They get a lower tax rate. I handed that bill to him. He said he liked the idea. I also handed him my Working Families Tax Relief Act, putting money directly in the pockets of the middle class. He liked that idea too. Our door has been open. Our door will continue to be open. We want to work together to pass tax cuts for working families, for middle-class Americans. We want to pass a bill that rewards employers who invest in American jobs. Mr. Chairman, let's work together to put money directly in the pockets of the American people.
Okay, thank you, Senator. Let's try and keep within the 4 minutes. Senator McCaskill.
I'll do my best, Mr. Chairman. I believe in reforming our tax code. I believe in cutting down some of the 70,000 pages in the code and making our system more fair and simple. I believe in bipartisanship, and I was so excited when I finally got an opportunity to serve on this committee. The Finance Committee, the home of bipartisanship, the home of a deliberative process. I actually believed this would be a year that I would get to participate in the famous bipartisan work of the Senate Finance Committee. So far, I've been very disappointed. There were no hearings on the health care bill, and now we're about to undertake a process that is so important. And we didn't even get a section-by-section analysis of this bill until 24 hours ago. 3 hours before we were supposed to have amendments filed. And it's being done through reconciliation. And Mr. Chairman, I adore you. I think you're a good man, and we've worked together and we're friends. But I'm going to quote you.
I like you too.
I'm going to quote you. On the floor of the Senate, you said, and I quote, "Reconciliation has become by its very nature a partisan process, and that using the reconciliation process would poison the well for tax reform, making it all but impossible." Those were your words a few years ago, Mr. Chairman. We have not been invited to the rooms where this bill was written. I've been told by some of my Republican colleagues who actually wrote the bill, he said, well, you know, maybe if you went and talked to this senator, I think they're the ones that are writing it, or maybe this senator, maybe they're the ones that are writing it. Are we really going to begin a markup in the Finance Committee when we didn't even get a full 24 hours to look at the section-by-section analysis before amendments were due? Are we really going to do that? And by the way, the section-by-section analysis we got yesterday afternoon was different than the description we got on Thursday. They weren't even the same. I need to know how Missourians will be impacted. I'm disappointed at the lack of simplification in this reform bill. Real reform means making the tax code more simple and fair. But I'm worried that by the time the process is all said and done, we're just going to make it that much more complex. I'm concerned about the parity between corporations and regular folks. It appears to me we haven't done away with very many loopholes to pay for the corporate rate reduction or business deductions. But boy, we've gotten rid of them for individuals. Think about this. A family of 4 in Missouri that gets a job outside of the city of Chicago, they can no longer deduct their moving expenses, but a business in St. Louis that decides to move its company to India can deduct their expenses. How fair is that? I'm specifically and most concerned about the changes to the complexity of the new pass-through rules. 95% of the businesses in America are pass-through entities. And we're making major changes with a lot of complexity about how they're going to be treated. You may have had hearings on big subjects, or you may have had working groups on big subjects. We've had no hearing on the specifics of this proposal and how it's going to impact Missouri businesses. There's nothing in here about the carried interest loophole, which we've been talking about for years, not even mentioned. Why is it not in this bill? We're in such a rush to pass this tax bill with just Republican votes that I'm afraid we've overlooked some serious consequences for our state. And I'll close with this, Mr. Chairman, because I don't want to go over. It is now clear in my state that this is going to blow a $1 billion hole in Missouri's budget because they're hooked. When the standard deduction is doubled for the federal, it's doubled at the state level. We have a balanced budget amendment in Missouri. They are already this year cutting the disabled and the elderly in terms of money that they receive. People who really need the money because of the budget problems they're having in Missouri. I need Missouri, the government in Missouri, the legislative leaders and the governor to tell me where that $1 billion is coming from. Are they going to raise Missouri's taxes, wiping out the benefit to the middle class in this bill? Or are they going to take even more money out of higher education, transportation, and payments to the elderly and disabled? We have no idea what those states are going to do. This is not well thought out, Mr. Chairman. We can do this better. I want to work with you. I want to work with Republicans. Give us a chance. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I received a letter from a constituent of mine a couple of weeks ago from Chester County, Pennsylvania. That was a letter that I left with the President after we met with him in the meeting that Senator Brown referred to. Here's in part what the letter said. It said, quote, "Why should high-income families get a tax break when we will likely get a tax hike in the case of his own family?" And then he goes on to say, "Is tax relief for families who never feel a pinch necessary at the expense of those who budget and live responsibly?" Unquote. Mr. Chairman, I have to echo those words. There is bipartisan agreement that we need tax reform, we need to reform the code, and we need to make it simpler and fairer. What's before us today, though, is not tax reform that prioritizes the middle class, but a tax scheme that's a giveaway to the super rich and big corporations at the expense of some, even many, middle-class families. We should be working together in a bipartisan way to raise wages by way of this process, to create jobs for the middle class, but instead, we have before us a Republican tax plan that was negotiated and written in secret by special interests in Washington and for special interests in Washington. That's likely the reason the plan is being rushed through with little oversight. This partisan bill, which moves around something on the order of $9 trillion in our economy, was released on Thursday night. We've been given 4 days to carefully review over 247 pages of proposed changes to the entire tax code and to understand the potential impact on businesses and residents in our state. Contrast that process with what happened in the Reagan years. The number 33 is probably the most relevant. 33 equals the number of hearings on the Reagan proposal. The Reagan proposal was so detailed it was 489 pages long. 27 hearings on that, and then 6 hearings on a House bill that went through long days of markup. So a total of 33 hearings either on President Reagan's proposal or the House bill. What about this bill? Well, according to an assessment we received from the Joint Committee on Tax, about 40% of Americans paying between $30,000 and $40,000 a year will see a tax increase or a tax cut of less than $9 a month in the year 2019.
This is just on the individual income tax side. The bill also makes significant changes to how and where we tax corporations. This bill could actually encourage outsourcing, which would be devastating to families across the board. The Senate bill includes a complicated calculation which may actually allow companies who outsource manufacturing to avoid paying any tax on those foreign profits. At best, and this is being generous, the Senate plan would tax foreign profits at a rate of 7.5% points less than profits earned in the United States. Let me make three final points, Mr. President. One, according to estimates from the Joint Committee on Taxation, Congress's official scorekeeper, at least 13.8 million middle-class households making under $200,000 will see a tax increase in 2019. The Joint Committee also found that under the House plan, 25% of taxpayers pay more under that scheme. And finally, the budget resolution, which kick-started the Republican tax plan, cuts Medicare and Medicaid by $1.5 trillion. So Republicans propose cutting nursing home care for seniors, cutting services for individuals with disabilities in the budget, while at the same time giving tax giveaways to the super rich. One final question, Mr. Chairman, I'd ask is that I wonder if anyone in the development of this bill asked a simple question. What will the impact on children be as a result of this bill? Will this bill make it more likely or less likely that children will be helped? I'm afraid that question was never asked. Mr. President, I will submit a longer statement for the record. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. We'll go to Senator Hiller now.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thanks for your leadership on this bill and for your thoughtful comments at the beginning of this hearing. Mr. Chairman, as you know, my mother was a school cook, and my father was an auto mechanic, probably the bluest of blue collars. And yet they constantly told their 6 children that if you work hard and play by the rules, you'll succeed. If you work hard and play by the rules, you'll live the American dream. Now, I've heard from too many Nevadans, too many Americans that have told me that the American dream is no longer the case. And that's the reason, Mr. Chairman, that we're here today. For too many people, the American dream is slipping away. Whether it's a single mother that I've heard from in Las Vegas who doesn't receive child support, works full-time, simply trying to make ends meet. I've heard from the entrepreneur in Elko who's fighting hard to get a small business off the ground, wondering whether he'll catch a break and be able to hire his first employee. I continue to hear from decent, hardworking Nevada families and small business owners who are struggling to cover their expenses and get ahead in life. And that's because, for too long, Nevadans and Americans across the country have faced stagnant wages, slow economic growth under the failed economic policies of the previous administration. As a result of economic policies of the previous administration, wages and workers have suffered. Job creation has suffered. Middle-class Americans have suffered. In Nevada, we still bear the scars of failed Obama-era economic policies. Real median household income is $7,000 lower today than it was 10 years ago. Nevada families are more likely to be living paycheck to paycheck than families living in nearly every other state. And the sad reality is that for most Nevadans, the recession has never really ended. And that's why I've been working each and every day with the chairman and for months with my colleagues on this committee to craft the tax relief package that we have in front of us today. Tax relief bill that accomplishes 3 major goals: creates more jobs, increases wages, and boosts American competitiveness. A passed bill that provides real meaningful tax relief to Nevada's middle class and to job creators. A tax bill that lets the middle class keep more of their hard-earned money, makes our tax code easier to understand. A tax bill that requires less paperwork and puts more money in people's back pockets. A tax bill that results in more jobs, higher wages, and growth in our communities. and a tax bill that significantly increases take-home pay and economic opportunity. Recent studies by the White House Council of Economic Advisors and Boston University economists suggest that as a result of this bill that we're talking about today, household incomes could rise by an average of $3,500 to $4,000. Now think about what another $3,000 to $4,000 in income would mean to a Nevada family that hasn't seen a pay raise in 10 years. Middle-class Nevadans and Americans across this great nation deserve a shot to a better life. We now have a president who is willing to work with us and sign meaningful tax reform into law. And it's time for this committee to act and deliver on providing true relief to middle-class taxpayers, to reinstate the refrain by my parents that the American dream is not only possible, but will be the reality for those who work hard and play by the rules. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Thune.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too want to congratulate you and your staff for the hard work that they put into getting us where we are today, and to say that it just isn't accurate the argument that's been made by some of our colleagues that somehow this was rushed upon us. I came on the Senate Finance Committee in 2011. Since 2011, we've had north of 70 hearings, 70 hearings, Senate Finance Committee hearings on tax reform. And I've sat through a good number of those, most of those I might add. And I don't think there's a single theme that's explored in this tax reform bill that wasn't covered in those hearings. And then in 2015, under the chairman's leadership, we created 5 working groups which examined in great detail every aspect of the tax code. I had the privilege of leading, along with Senator Cardin, a working group that looked at business taxation. And staff and members spent literally hundreds of hours diving into the details, the finer points of a lot of these issues, and then filing a report and making recommendations. There has been a ton of work put into getting where we are today, and I thank you for that, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
And let me just say, too, that, one of the things that point that's been made here again is this is a typical throwaway line for Democrats, and that is that this is all tax cuts for the rich. As has been pointed out by some of my colleagues here, this will deliver tax relief to middle-income families. That is an objective and indisputable fact. You are nearly doubling the standard deduction, increasing the child tax credit, lowering rates. Middle-income families are going to get tax relief from this effort. And boy, do they need it, because a lot of American families are living paycheck to paycheck. In fact, a recent survey had 50% of American families saying that they're living paycheck to paycheck and that they're only one crisis, or one, I should say, incident away from a financial crisis. So this is about putting more money in their pockets so they can deal with their day-to-day issues in their families and allow them to have bigger paychecks and more take-home pay. But secondly, it's about growth. This fundamentally is about economic growth. Why? Because we've been having these abysmal growth rates for the last 8 years of 1.5% to 2%. And the Congressional Budget Office has said we're going to grow at less than 2% for the next decade. Well, I just don't think 1.8%, 1.9% growth is good enough. That should not be the new normal in this country. We've got to get this economy growing at a faster rate. And what happens when the economy is growing at a faster rate? Well, it means that businesses are expanding and growing their operations. It means the demand for labor goes up. When the demand for labor goes up, the price goes up. And what's the result of that? Higher wages. That's what this is about. Higher wages for American families who literally haven't had a pay raise in nearly a decade. That's what economic growth does for an economy. And we know that tax reform will lead to greater economic growth, because we know right now that our tax code is completely non-competitive in the global marketplace. If we don't get competitive in the global marketplace, we're going to continue to hemorrhage jobs, hemorrhage companies, hemorrhage profits, hemorrhage investments to other parts around the world. We have to make America an attractive place to invest if we're going to get normal growth back into our economy. And then the issue, of course, that's been raised too is about deficits, which I've been here long enough now to know that we don't have 60 votes to cut spending. We certainly don't have 60 votes to do anything about reforming entitlement programs. We probably don't have 51 votes to do anything about reforming entitlement programs, because we just don't. I mean, I've been here long enough to know nobody wants to take this issue seriously, which we have to do if we're going to get our arms around making our spending, government programs sustainable in the long term. But the one thing that we can do through tax reform, if we get greater growth in the economy, is start to generate more revenue for the government. 1 percentage point increase in the growth in the GDP will generate an additional $3 trillion over the next decade in terms of revenue coming into the government. If we want to deal with deficits, if we want to deal with debt, we got to get growth back. And the only way we get growth back in this economy, Mr. Chairman, is to start doing the types of things, putting policies in place that are going to make America an attractive place to invest. And so I just want to thank you for your leadership on this, and I'll mention a couple of things. The INVEST Act that you incorporated into this legislation would simplify accounting rules for businesses, substantially accelerate cost recovery for small and medium-sized businesses, which was a bill that I introduced. You also included the GIG Act, and put simply, this is legislation that addresses worker classification by creating a safe harbor for those who want to work as an independent contractor. Those are both important pieces of legislation for small and medium-sized businesses. Mr. Chairman, I just want to say again, you know, if you look at what we're trying to accomplish here, it's higher wages, better paying jobs, more growth in the economy, tax relief for middle-income families, and keeping jobs here in this country. That's what this exercise is about. And if we're going to be competitive in the global marketplace, we simply have to reform our tax code and simplify it. Mr. Chairman, with that, I will yield back the balance of my time.
Well, thank you, Senator Enzi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for holding this important, historic beginning of a markup today to consider tax reform that'll boost America's economy, it'll create more jobs, and it'll leave more money in people's pockets from their paycheck. And it's just the beginning of the process. Once we finish some specific questions tomorrow, we'll begin the amendments. And it's my understanding there are over 300 amendments that have been submitted that can be debated. That's an opportunity for everybody to have a say in this bill. And that's not the end of it. When it makes it out of committee, it'll go to the floor. And there's also the opportunity there for amendments. Actually, under this process, it's for virtually unlimited amendments. After the last amendment is voted on, another one can be put in. So there's a lot of opportunity for everybody to have input into this process. There has to be a structure to start with, and there is a structure here to start with. A lot of things have changed since 1986, but unfortunately our tax code isn't one of them. It's an outdated mess, and it's hurting America's workers, and it's holding our economy back. That's why we need tax reform that'll not only make the system simpler and fairer, but it'll put more money in people's pockets. Simpler, that we're talking about, somebody said that we should be able to file on a postcard. And one of the young staffers said, "What's a postcard?" So I think we'll have to have one screen on an app to take care of most of the people now. But it needs to be simpler, it needs to be fairer, it needs to grow the economy to create more jobs and to raise wages. After years of stagnant growth, tax relief for every American is how we can help jumpstart our economy. Now, under the previous administration, they had this idea that we just did some shovel-ready projects, we could stimulate the economy. It only cost about $1 trillion. That was a dream. Some of them haven't even been spent yet, but it didn't work. The economy went to 1 9/10% GDP. That's productivity growth in the private sector, and that's incidentally where most of the money comes from. That's where most of the people work. 1 9/10%. The norm is 3 2/10%, and we're just hoping that with some change now, a little different approach. This is the approach the President has asked for, that this approach will increase the productivity about 0.4% and pay for itself that way. Now, along with tax cuts and fairness, we also need to make our tax system simpler. And by simplifying the code, we will ensure hardworking Americans aren't missing out on available tax relief. This bill provides relief for small, family-owned businesses. In fact, that's a major part. That's the pass-through businesses. That's where most of the jobs are created. We want to make sure that small businesses, which currently employ the majority of the private sector in Wyoming, that's the backbone of the communities, and they'll have the opportunity to grow and provide more jobs. I talked to some of them over the weekend, and I think they're excited about what we're doing. If you care about jobs, if you care about American companies not moving overseas and being able to compete globally, then you also care about changing the business tax. America has the 4th highest corporate tax rate. We need to encourage companies to bring back their overseas money to increase the number of jobs. Lowering our uncommonly high and uncompetitive business tax rate would be one of the quickest ways to solve the problem. It's time we make America a more inviting place to invest, to do business, to create jobs, especially in the small businesses. One of my long-time legislative priorities has been international tax reform, which includes efforts to encourage U.S. headquartered multinational companies to bring their money back to the U.S. and create a level playing field. We've forced our multinational companies to operate with a set of tax rules that are more than 50 years old. I hope we can change that. I look forward to working with my colleagues to pass tax reform that will not only benefit hardworking Americans, but it'll make our country stronger. I yield.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Cassidy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First point to make about this bill is it'll be a tax cut for working families in Louisiana. For the last decade, those working families had real challenges. Since 2008, we've had the slowest economic recovery in U.S. history. Folks back home saw jobs leave, healthcare costs skyrocket, paychecks stayed flat, even as the cost of living increased. It's been harder and harder to work hard, play by the rules, and still get ahead. Americans expect and deserve better. Several more points to make. Tax reform will put the American dream within reach again by letting people earn more money and keep their money. The bill, again, cuts taxes across the board, almost doubling the standard deduction so that a family's first $24,000 in income is tax-free. It expands the child tax credit to $1,650 per child. According to the Tax Foundation's analysis, the bill will boost take-home pay for Louisiana families by approximately $1,900 a year. More money for groceries, education, retirement, and for raising kids. Imagine that would mean to families from Monroe to Lake Charles, Shreveport to New Orleans. It'll mean a big difference in their life. Another point, tax reform helps create better paying jobs and increase opportunity for everyone. Now, the current tax code encourages American companies to move overseas and/or for a foreign company to buy the American company. This bill changes that and instead encourages companies to invest in the United States. Investment creates jobs. Again, according to the Tax Foundation's analysis, this bill would create more than 12,600 new jobs in Louisiana alone, nationwide creating nearly 1 million new jobs. And when there's competition for workers, companies bid up workers' wages and they give better benefits, all in an attempt to recruit those workers. Next point, for Louisiana particularly, this job will encourage energy producers to make investments in the Gulf Coast and provide good-paying jobs to those workers. This will reinforce America's status as the world's energy superpower with all the economic, national security, and geopolitical benefits that come along. Outside of energy, the inclusion of provisions like the historic tax credit is very positive for my state. That single provision has supported more than 38,000 jobs and $2 billion in development in Louisiana since 2002. Last point, tax reform is a key priority for President Trump, for Republicans in the House, and for us in the Senate. We're united in our goal to reform the tax code, cutting taxes for working families. I'm proud of the work we've done here, Mr. Chairman. Congratulations. I look forward to working with everyone to make it even better. We're going to keep working until we can get the job done and provide Louisiana families and workers with the support they need and deserve. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Well, thank you, Senator. We appreciate your work. Senator Warner.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me also start echoing what Senator McCaskill said. I was really anxious to get on this committee, spent a lot of time, and very much appreciate the fact that when times were whether I'd stay on or not, you were in my corner. I appreciate that. But I have to tell you, sir, I am so disappointed by the process.
I'd like to stay in that corner.
I understand that. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to get us both back in that corner together. But I just got to tell you, this...
You're doing well.
This process, I think, has been opaque. I think it does not uphold the strong bipartisan credentials that you and the ranking member have brought to so many issues. And I guess wonder why the majority has kept so much of this secret. As Senator McCaskill said, again, rushing this through with no time. I think at the end of the day, this is not a bill that more sunshine and sunlight is going to help. I think we're going to see, whether it's pass-throughs or a host of these other issues, that we have rushed through without proper review and appropriate examination. Let me also mention the fact that I know a number of individuals have mentioned earlier efforts in this arena. One that I was proud to be involved in was Simpson Bowles. Those of us, many of us, who tried to bring that plan forward. But let me make sure we recall Simpson Bowles. Yes, it lowered corporate rates, but it was actually fully paid for. It even actually increased our revenue flow. Because while I'll acknowledge, Mr. Chairman, we do have one of the highest corporate tax rates in the world, and we do need to lower it to make it more competitive. You also have to acknowledge the fact that if you look at America's total tax burden, compared to all of our competitive countries around the world, America ranks 31st out of 34. Now, that's an unfortunate fact that people don't like to acknowledge too often, but if we're going to look at how we stay competitive with countries that have much lower corporate rates, we've got to look at how they're generating revenues, and frankly, we haven't looked at those to the level it needs of examination. The bulk of this reform does provide business tax cuts. And again, I'll acknowledge we need a more competitive corporate tax system. But if we look at recent behavior, if we look at recent corporate behavior, there's no evidence that these additional corporate profits will actually translate into higher pay for workers. I would simply point out data that points that in the last couple of quarters, as much as 95% of all corporate profits have been spent on share buybacks and dividends. It's not transferred down to workers. I also know that balanced tax reform should grow the economy and not national debt. You start with a bogey of $1.5 trillion that, in fact, we're not going to count. That will add billions of dollars to our annual debt payments that are already in excess of $150 billion a year because of the mutually assured destruction that we have when we've accumulated $20 trillion in debt over the last 70-plus years. Adding more to that, I think, is a huge mistake, Mr. Chairman. Now, I know a number of members have said, hey, this is going to provide growth. We shouldn't accept these low growth rates. I agree. But I challenge any member on the other side to show me a time when tax cuts paid for with borrowed money, particularly at moments of near full employment, have led to any type of the growth numbers that you built into your plan. Don't take my word for it. Alan Greenspan said that just last week. Tax cuts with borrowed money near full employment will not provide growth. My time's running down. I do hope that we will have a chance, and I'm going to have a series of amendments. For example, I've got an amendment that I hope that I will gain your support and others that said if for those companies who are going to get particularly the great rate that might be offered on repatriation, maybe there ought to be a requirement for those companies to offer meaningful workforce training programs to those low and moderate income workers. I'll offer a plan that Senator Thune and I worked on for a long time that would actually encourage businesses to help pay back student debt. I've got another amendment that would ensure that rate cuts would only go into effect if we meet those revenue triggers. If you believe the growth projections, let's both have a little skin in the game. Let's then have a trigger in case those projections are not met. I'm going to exceed my time I already have. Mr. Chairman, I do hope we get a chance to work on this together. I appreciate your and the ranking member's leadership. This is way too important to rush through, and I hope that we can slow the process down so we can get it right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Senator. Appreciate it. And we'll call on Senator Cardin at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start by saying that I am really disappointed that as we start this debate, the two basic principles that I thought members of this committee would embrace are being violated. First, this bill is not aimed at middle-income families. when you take a look at how much relief is given at the highest income levels versus the type of relief in middle-income families, you understand that this bill is aimed at the wealthy. The modifications in the estate tax, the elimination of the alternative minimum tax, that benefits wealthy families. And the Joint Tax Committee tells us in 2023, in excess of 10 million families will actually, middle-income families will actually pay more in income taxes. So it's not skewed towards middle-income families. It's skewed towards business tax relief and high-income families. Why? Because you've eliminated such things as the state and local tax deduction. Let me just qualify that. You've eliminated the state and local tax deductions for individuals, but not for businesses. They can still take their tax deductions, just individuals cannot. In my state of Maryland, almost 50% of our taxpayers use the state and local tax deduction. So that's not fair. If we look at what the House did, some of the individual tax changes are temporary where the business taxes were made permanent. We know this is not the last we're going to hear of it. I expect this will even get more skewed towards wealthy families. But the second condition has also been violated, and that is that this bill blows a hole in the deficit. I understand you like to use a magic wand and say that we'll get growth to deal with it. We have objective scorekeepers that have been traditionally right in their projections. What you're trying to do is put 3 pounds of sugar in a 1.5 pound bag. It doesn't fit. It doesn't fit. We're going to increase the deficits, and that's not a way for economic growth. There's a better way. And you're creating problems. I mentioned state and local tax. To me, that's a double tax. It's not fair. And I heard some of my Republican colleagues say, we're doing this because it's more Democratic states that look like have the higher percentage of taxpayers. By the way, it's taxpayers in all states that are going to get hurt by the elimination of state and local taxes. But I hope we understand that this is the United States, because we could get into some nasty regional battles on transportation bills, on agricultural bills, but we try to do the policy that's right. And double taxation for taxpayers not to be able to take their state and local taxes as a deduction on their income taxes is just plain wrong and not good policy. You're also creating other problems, and I'll just give you one example I find just outrageous, and that is discounting the historic tax credits. That's used in my state and around the nation to get renewals in communities that desperately need economic opportunity. And that's just one example of a tool that's going to be weakened. Quite frankly, there's a better way. If we want to create jobs, then why don't we take a bipartisan proposal we had in the last Congress, use the funds that come from repatriation, and put it in infrastructure? We know we're going to get a lot more jobs that way. Let's rebuild America. The President said he wanted that, but no, you're taking this money and using it for other purposes. There's a better way for economic development. Let's improve the low-income housing tax credit and new market tax credits, historic tax credits. That'll create jobs, particularly in vulnerable communities that need that help. But no, you're not improving those tools that are available if we're really interested in job growth. Why don't we do something to really improve retirement security in this country? We have bipartisan proposals to do it. But no, we don't see any real effort made to improve retirement security. Yes, there is a better way. Senator Warner's right. All of us understand that we have global competition issues, but we're the only country in the industrial world that uses exclusively income taxes for business. Why aren't we looking at alternative ways? Some of us have put forward proposals to do that, as the chairman is aware, the proposal that I brought forward. We want to work in a bipartisan manner. Why? Because we'll get a better bill, and it will stand the test of time. We're not getting off to a good start here. I would urge the chairman to recognize that this is not a transformational bill that you brought forward. You put together tax cuts of various groups in a package that makes little sense for middle-income families and for our national debt.
Senator Stafford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's no question we need tax reform that creates jobs and incentivizes companies to bring jobs back to America, helps small businesses, and puts more money in the pockets of middle-class families in Michigan and across the country. If that was in the bill in front of us, I would enthusiastically support it. However, that is not what's in the Republican bill. Instead, it's the same trickle-down scheme that's failed every time it's been tried. And we know between the House and Senate bills, millions of middle-income Americans will actually get a tax increase. Since 1979, we've seen huge gains in the stock market, and wages for the top 1% have grown by 138%. But middle-income families aren't feeling it. In fact, the vast majority of American workers have seen their wages stagnate or even go down. Profits have gone up, but not paychecks. Now, our Republican colleagues have promised these same hardworking middle-class families that by once again giving the top 1% and the largest corporations huge tax giveaways, workers can magically receive $4,000 or $7,000 or $9,000 raises. Well, Mr. Chairman, the proof is in their paychecks. There's absolutely no evidence from past supply-side tax giveaways that it results in hiring more people or raising workers' wages. We've heard these same trickle-down promises before, back with the Bush tax cuts in 2001, 2003. My colleagues from across the aisle said on the floor that the Bush tax cuts would, quote, aid the people and businesses who make up our economic machine and get it moving down the tracks at full speed, unquote. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. The train derailed, growth was almost non-existent, and the deficit exploded. Middle-class families saw little lasting benefit. But the huge deficits were used by the Republicans as the reason that then they wanted to privatize Social Security, which fortunately Democrats stopped. Economist Bruce Bartlett served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Economic Policy during the Reagan and George H.W. Bush administrations. Last month, when asked if tax cuts pay for themselves through greater economic growth, Mr. Bartlett had some strong words, and I quote, "That's a lie. It's always been a lie. There's not one iota of evidence that will support this argument." In fact, he said wages fell for 10 years after enactment of Tax Reform Act of 1986. And there's another part of what's happening now that is very concerning to me, Mr. Chairman. The recently passed Republican budget resolution makes it clear that after passing the huge trickle-down tax giveaways, an increase in the deficit by at least $1.5 trillion, the next step will be to use the newly created debt as an excuse to cut Medicare and Medicaid. In fact, almost $1.5 trillion in cuts is in the budget. You know, there's another recent example of this supply-side approach to tax reform not working as well. In 2012, our former Senate colleague and now Governor Sam Brownback promised the people of Kansas that giving huge tax giveaways to large corporations and the wealthy would supercharge the state's economy. Unfortunately, it did not. The state of Kansas bond rating fell. They were 48th out of 50 in job growth, and they had a $900 million budget shortfall, which caused some communities to cut schools to 4 days a week in order to balance their budget. The people of Kansas revolted. Early this year, a coalition of Republicans and Democrats in the legislature reversed most of the tax giveaways. In other words, middle-class families were sold a bill of goods and were left with a mound of debt. Michigan families deserve a $4,000 or a $7,000 or even a $9,000 raise. Republicans have made these promises, and I believe these promises should be kept. But if this trickle-down scheme fails again, and middle-class families just get mounds of debt and cuts in services, I believe Congress should commit to stopping the tax giveaways just like they did in Kansas. I'm going to offer, Mr. Chairman, a number of changes that will ensure the benefits of these tax cuts go to middle-income families and that the promises being made to them will be kept. And if my Republican colleagues are serious, and I hope they are, in putting more money in the pockets of middle-income people, I hope you will join me. For hardworking families in Michigan, it's really simple. The proof is in their paycheck. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Carper.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. For more than 9 years since I first joined this committee, I've wanted to do tax reform, like many of you. I've always believed that a sensible, equitable, fiscally responsible tax overhaul could help grow our economy, create good-paying jobs, and boost wages so more families have a better shot at the American dream. I have a great deal of respect, affection, if you will, for our chairman, ranking member, and many of our colleagues on both sides of the aisle. But many of us have worked together for a long time. And unfortunately, however, the process used to try and force this tax bill across the finish line is not a credit to the bipartisan tradition of this committee. We can, and more importantly, we should, do better than this. I was here when this committee wrote the Affordable Care Act. I recall that our friends on the other side of the aisle objected, claiming that Congress was moving, quote, too fast in trying to remake one-sixth of the economy. Close review of that process we used then suggests otherwise. We didn't move too fast. In fact, in the year before this committee passed the Affordable Care Act, more than a dozen bipartisan hearings were held on the health reform proposal that became the Affordable Care Act. We held multiple bipartisan roundtables, and several bipartisan option papers were published. In addition, there were detailed, exhaustive negotiations with between 3 senior Democratic members of this committee and 3 senior Republican members of this committee. They lasted for 3 months, as I recall. Unfortunately, we have had no hearings on this tax reform proposal, none. We've held no bipartisan negotiations, none. We've held no bipartisan roundtables, none. The proposals in this bill, which was released just 4 days ago, attempt to make not 1/6 of our economy, but literally 100% of our economy. Meanwhile, the public has been told next to nothing about how this legislation might affect them. A truly bipartisan effort would not involve ramming through such imperfect legislation on a partisan vote using the reconciliation process. A truly bipartisan effort would have begun months ago. It would have been done through regular order, with bipartisan engagement, with careful and thoughtful negotiations occurring over months. A truly bipartisan effort would have been open and inclusive, with members of both parties sitting at the table. Unfortunately, none of that applies to the process that's being used here. This process stands in stark contrast to the bipartisan efforts led by Senators Lamar Alexander and Patty Murray on the Help Committee to find bipartisan solutions to stabilizing the health care exchanges. It's not surprising that a flawed process has produced a flawed product. This isn't the kind of bipartisan tax reform we ought to be doing. And as my colleagues may recall, when considering any tax proposal, I always look at it through the prism of 4 questions. The first question is it fair? In answer to that question, I'm afraid that this tax bill will likely increase taxes on millions of middle-class families beginning next year. I fear that this bill will make it harder for many Americans to buy a home. I fear that this bill will imperil state and local funding for education and funding for health care, as well as for college aid and job training, as well as for transportation and for first responders and so many other crucial services. Yet, there is somehow enough fiscal room in this bill to offer large tax cuts to high-income households and to many corporations. This bill makes it easier for family dynasties to give inheritance to their wealthy heirs. This bill cuts the top tax rate and eliminates the required minimum tax for wealthiest Americans. None of this meets my definition of fairness. The second question I always ask when faced with tax reform proposals is this: does it foster economic growth and job creation? It's hard to separate the economic effects from large deficits that this bill would create. As more and more federal debt piles up as a result of this tax bill, interest rates are likely to rise, making it harder and harder for Americans to buy a home, finance a higher education, and run a business. This bill also includes reforms to the international tax system, but lacks the necessary guardrails to prevent the offshoring of American jobs and the offshoring of our tax base. As more American jobs go overseas as a result of this legislation, as more corporate profits are shifted overseas as a result of this bill, Americans will be looking back at this moment, at this point in time, at this process in the Congress, and they will know who is to blame. The third question I always ask when faced with a tax reform proposal is this: does it make the tax code simpler or more complex? I support a well-designed proposal to double the standard deduction, as this bill does. But there's still more work to be done to make the tax code simpler. And unfortunately, this bill introduces new and complicated provisions, for example, new requirements to claim the child tax credit that will make it difficult for Americans to file their taxes. The fourth question I ask, maybe the most important one, is this measure fiscally responsible? And sadly, the answer is absolutely not. This bill blows a $1.5 trillion a hole in the deficit, and it will wind up being far more costly, I suspect, than that as the deficits continue to grow in the years and decades beyond the next 10 years. Today, we have a $666 billion federal deficit. I think that was the deficit for the year that just ended. 8 years into the longest-running economic expansion of our country. The last thing we need to do is to continue to run up the deficit. When our economy is expanding, we ought to be reducing the deficit, not blowing it up higher. If truth be told, exploiting our deficits to pay for a tax break mostly for the wealthiest people in our country is just not unnecessary. It's, I think, unconscionable. Not a single senator up here is opposed to every single thing in this bill, but the bulk of this bill is, frankly, to me, unacceptable. Not all of it, but much of it. It's not good for American economy, American families. I don't think it's good for American workers or American businesses or American children. And in the end, it's going to be borne by future generations. I just want to implore the chairman and our friends on the other side of the aisle. Let's go back to the drawing board. Let's start anew on a real bipartisan basis. Let's write something that can be permanent, that will endure. Let's write something that actually is fair, that actually fosters economic growth, that actually simplifies the tax code, and that actually reduces the deficit, not make it larger. Let's write a tax reform bill that is fair and fiscally responsible. Let's do tax reform right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, if I could just say one last quick thing. Sitting next to you, and Mr. Chairman, you've been a great advocate and really enabler of bipartisan compromises in the past, not just with Ted Kennedy, but all kinds of people. This man sitting next to you, Ron Wyden, he has crafted not one, but two major tax reform proposals in the last several years. Not one, but two. And with his leadership, and hopefully the support of even Ben Cardin here, we can do this. We can do this. Let's just hit the pause button and see if we can't do it right. Thank you.
I agree we can do it, now, but we haven't been able so far. Senator Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is certainly a good day in the United States Senate. It is a very good day, hopefully, for the country as we think about the opportunities to lower taxes and at the same time create more jobs here at home. The two pillars of tax reform, the first pillar is simple. Let's make sure more Americans can take home more of their paychecks. What does that mean? Well, if you are a single mother, the average single head of household in this country makes less than $36,000 a year. Well, what that means, take home more of your hard-earned money. What it means is about a 55% cut. 55% cut in your tax burden under our plan. When we talk about the numbers of tax reform, we can easily get folks lost, and you can see their eyes glaze over. But we're not talking about the numbers. Tax reform is about the people. Not only the single head of households, but also folks who have dependent children. In our plan, $1,650 is the new child tax credit. Not $1,000, but $1,650. Because what we know in America is that it's getting harder and harder for everyday Americans, the typical American household, to make ends meet. Not only are we looking for ways to help the typical American family who makes about $73,000 a year keep more of their hard-earned money, about a $1,500 cut. We're also going to make sure we build and create the jobs of the future here at home by making America more competitive with our competitors around the world. Today, we have a 35% tax rate, which is the highest in the industrial world. Said differently, when you compare us to our OECD partners, 35% versus the average of 22%. What does that mean, the 13%? Well, what it means is something very simple. Fewer jobs created at home. We also have a global system of taxing versus a territorial system. Said differently, let's make sure that profits all over the world made by American companies are able to be reinvested in our country without double taxation. Mr. Chairman, this is a generational opportunity that we must seize, and that begins this week in this committee when we have the votes to pass to the full floor of the Senate tax reform, which is defined as tax relief for typical American families and the ability to create the jobs of the future here at home. It is a good day for all Americans. It is a good day in Washington when we focus on the American people. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman. Thank you, Senator. Yes, the ranking member.
Mr. Chairman, I think we're awaiting Senator Nelson, and I appreciate your courtesy, and I think you and I have some brief wrap-up remarks before we finish for the day. I think, Mr. Chairman, you're a very skilled lawyer, and as you know, I ran the legal aid office for the elderly, so I'm not in your league, but if this was a lawsuit, I think we would stipulate to key facts that the public would see would take us in the right direction. Both sides have made it clear. We think the tax code is a dysfunctional mess. I call it a rotting economic carcass. We're in agreement on that. Both sides say they want to have bipartisan tax reform. And I think we understand why, because to grow the economy, to encourage innovation, you need certainty and predictability, and you only get that through bipartisanship. And I appreciated your throwing me all these bouquets saying that the bipartisan bill we now have with Senator Coates is like yours, but respectfully, they could not be more different. We tripled the standard deduction in the bipartisan bill with no takeaways. So we don't take away those personal exemptions that are so important, for example, to a large family in Missouri or Maryland. So big difference on the middle class. We reward creating red, white, and blue jobs, jobs in America. But the way this bill is written, those American multinationals get a better break overseas than they do for doing business in the United States. And third, we move to a closer relationship between income from a wage and income from capital. And as Senator McCaskill said, the capital gains and some of the provisions have all stayed the same, and yet what we did in the bipartisan bill is we reduced the differential between income from a wage and income from capital. And I think the way I would like to close our arguments for today is if this committee did what the president has repeatedly said he wants done, and I'll tick them off, a focus on the middle class. I was in a session where he said specifically it shouldn't go to people like me. And he said he doesn't want to hurt Medicare and Social Security, the challenges that we'll have by the exploding deficits. And he wants it to be bipartisan. If we did in this committee on a bipartisan basis what the president has said he wants to do, we could have a debate the committee would be proud of. It would get, in my view, 80 votes on the floor of the United States Senate, and across America, people would say that on an issue that really touches on the remaking of the American economy for generations to come, Democrats and Republicans would crucially have found some common ground. There is still time to do that. I expect tomorrow, because the majority keeps altering their bill, we're going to see some new contortions to try to figure out how to make the Republican bill, the partisan bill, fit the budget strictures while still being this multi-trillion-dollar bait and switch, taking from the middle class, supporting the multinationals. So it does not have to be this way, Mr. Chairman. That's the lesson of the last 2.5 hours, is that there is a lot of goodwill on both sides. If this was a lawsuit, we pretty much stipulate to those things the desire for a bipartisan approach, a recognition of how egregiously broken the system is, and then get on with it. You and I have done a lot of bipartisan work together. This stands out as a great departure from that, and I hope as we move to tomorrow's session, where I think there will be very spirited questioning of Mr. Barthold, the head of the Joint Committee on Taxation, that we can still recover both the substance and the spirit of the Finance Committee's storied history. I walked through the anteroom today and looked at all of those great leaders, Democrats and Republicans. They would not have much favorable to say about the way in which this is being proposed, and there is still time to change it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Senator. I thought the hearing was a good hearing. I want to thank everyone who participated here today. Before we adjourn for the evening, I want to clarify a few points that have been raised during today's statements. I'll boil it down to a few key points so that there will be no mistaking my meaning. This bill is not a massive tax cut on the wealthy. It provides across-the-board tax relief for those in the middle class getting the largest proportional benefit. In fact, millionaires and billionaires will shoulder a larger portion of the tax burden under this bill. That's not just me talking. That's the Joint Committee on Taxation's conclusion. Number two, this bill is not a massive tax increase on the middle class, which I find really surprising. While no one can guarantee that a tax plan will have the same type of impact for every single taxpayer, our bill comes very close. According to JCT, roughly 90% of middle-class families will see their taxes go down, or at the very least, stay the same. That's an exceptional level of success that some of our colleagues would have us ignore in favor of some raw numbers cited out of context. Number three, this is not a big giveaway to corporations. Virtually every member of this committee has, at one time or another, expressed support for reducing corporate tax rates. Our bill does so in a reasonable manner, placing our country well within the mainstream among industrialized nations. Both Republicans and Democrats have recognized the need to let American businesses be more competitive. My Democratic colleagues said an aversion, to accomplishing that goal by reasonably reducing the corporate tax rate is pretty recent development. It's a pretty recent development and clearly has more to do with politics than any sincere views on policy. Number four, the process for producing and considering this bill has not been unnecessarily abbreviated or secretive. There's nothing secret about all this. The committee does not typically have specific hearings to examine specific pieces of legislation. That is not the tradition of the committee. We've been at this now for more than 6 years. We've had 70-plus hearings, numerous reports, and countless opportunities in public discussion on the issues under consideration. Any demand for additional process at this point is likely more about delay than about uncovering any new information. Number five, the claims that Democrats have been shut out of the process are false. The Democrats on the committee most certainly recall the letter they all signed in which they issued preconditions and ultimatums for their participation in a bipartisan tax reform process. I've essentially taken them at their word. Yet I have also stated in hearings, markups, and on the Senate floor that I want to see Democrats at the table for this exercise, so long as they are willing to come without preconditions or unreasonable demands. No one took me up on this offer, no one. And my door has always been open. Everybody knows me. They've seen me manage 3 major committees in the United States Senate. And they've seen me work across the aisle with all kinds of Democrats throughout these years, some of whom were very difficult to work with. Some of whom are considered great Democrats. You know, no one took me up on this offer, and my door's always been open. Now, we'll get into these issues more as this week rolls on, but given some of what we've heard here so far, I thought these points needed to be reiterated. Look, I have a desire to make this committee operate fairly, in a straightforward way, with consideration for my colleagues on the Democratic side and my colleagues on the Republican side. And I think I have a reputation for trying to do exactly that. These aren't issues we all don't understand. We've been working on them for decades. And frankly, it gets a little old sometimes when you hear the same old worn-out arguments every time when they can't, you know, when they don't really work with us to get these things done. Now, I respect my Democratic colleagues. We have some of the brightest Democrats in the Senate on this committee, which we should. And I'd appreciate it if they worked more with us and quit the belly aching and let's get some things done for the American people. I don't think they're ever going to have a chairman who's more willing to try and get them done in a bipartisan way than I am. And I've got the reputation to prove that. And you know, the great liberal Democrat was Ted Kennedy. And he found out that, by gosh, we could work together, and he enjoyed it. And frankly, he wasn't easy to work with sometimes, but then in the end, before it was all done, he and I passed some of the most important bills in history. And frankly, no one was more proud of passing those bills than Ted Kennedy was. And you can say the same thing about a whole raft of others in the United States Senate as well. My goal is not to play partisan politics on this committee. But I am a tough guy, and if we can't get cooperation, we're going to move ahead whether you like it or not. But I'd prefer the cooperation. I'd prefer us working together. I'd prefer us using our best efforts to try and get the best tax system in the United States that we've ever had before. Thus far, I don't think we've worked together, to be honest with you, and I'm not sure that we ever will on this committee. It's disturbing to me because this is the most important committee, especially on taxation and economics, of any committee in the Congress of the United States. I do get along well with Senator Wyden. We work together well. We meet regularly together. He's always open. He's always been straightforward about his feelings. And I think I get along well with every other member on this committee. But this shouldn't be just a Democrat and Republican committee. And we've got to start working together in order to make this committee really reach its potential and live up to its potential that it has lived up to in the past. Now, we have one last person to call on tonight, and that's Senator Nelson. I'll bet you're glad I've made these comments.
And as Bill Nelson, as Bill Nelson proceeds, thank you for your courtesy, Mr. Chairman, for waiting for Senator Nelson.
Senator Nelson, we'll take you for 5 minutes.
Thank you,
Go 1 second beyond, I'm going to have trouble.
Okay. Well, you appropriately introduced what I wanted to talk about, Mr. Chairman. I want to talk about bipartisanship.
Good.
It's the best way to ensure outcome for ordinary Americans, and it's what the American people want. And I definitely know that's what the people in Florida want. Is anyone proud of the way this process has been going? I don't think so, where it's all done by one party. And here we are working on a major tax bill, a bill that will inevitably touch every single American in some way, shape, or form, and in some cases in ways that the drafters of the bill don't even know. Yet, in completely rewriting the tax code, we haven't had any hearings or any time to seriously debate the slew of policy changes that will affect people's everyday lives. So let me give you an example. We got word just the other day that the Joint Committee on Taxation didn't know if the new pass-through deduction in the chairman's mark includes business income made in Puerto Rico. By the way, the people in Puerto Rico are hurting. And the chairman knows that because he was the chairman of the task force that both Senator Rubio and I had the privilege of being a part of. Well, it would seem to me kind of common sense that we really ought to get an answer on that before we move forward. And the point is this, that this isn't the way we ought to be operating. Everybody here knows it. We should be working together to negotiate a truly bipartisan tax plan instead of throwing this all together on the fly. This thing was introduced Friday, and here it is Monday. Well, I believe that we have a duty to serve the American people to the best of our ability, and I think on a major tax rewrite, of which I was in the Congress the last time in 1986 that we voted out a major tax rewrite, we didn't do it this way. Working together in a bipartisan way is not a radical idea. We've done it before. Now, how many times have we come together to find common ground? Just last year, we passed the Retirement Enhancement and Savings Act. It came out of committee, 26 zip. And it started with you and Senator Wyden hashing out differences to find a workable middle place, a consensus place. And then, as I said, don't forget the Puerto Rico task force that you chaired, or the identity theft-related tax fraud bill. It took months of bipartisan talks before we had a package that everyone could agree on. I don't think it's too much to ask for this, a total rewrite of the tax code to go this way. So if you're going to cut me off in 30 seconds, I'll mention that this senator has done with Senator Grassley, Senator Cornyn, Senator Thune, that I have the privilege of sharing in the leadership in the Commerce Committee. We've all done bipartisan bills together. And if you want a good example of bipartisanship, look at how Senator Thune and I worked together on the Commerce Committee. I could mention Senator Burr, I could mention Senator Isaacson, all of which, and I will put those details into the record of where we have worked together. And so the picture is clear. We all want tax cuts for the middle class. We all want to help small businesses. We all want to make the tax code simpler, fairer, and more competitive. And I'm hopeful that this markup isn't just window dressing, and I hope that some of our amendments will be given serious consideration. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your kindness in recognizing me so that I could give these remarks, and I'd like to insert my full statement in the record.
Without objection. We're really happy you could make it. We know you've had extra things on your plate for quite a while here. And we're with you, and as you know, I've helped with Puerto Rico and with a lot of these issues that are very serious issues that you have to deal with on a daily basis that the rest of us may not have to, other than when it comes up for the full Senate. And I appreciate the work that you're doing. Let me just say this. I want to thank all my colleagues on this committee. It's a good committee. We have great people on here, very intelligent people. But I've seen it move towards too much partisanship. And if it keeps going that way, I'm the wrong guy to do that to. because I can play that role very, very well. My friend Ted Kennedy found that out, and boy, he realized it was better to work together.
That is a great example, Mr. Chairman, the role models that you and Senator Kennedy set.
Well, I think that was a good example. I think that Ron White and I set a pretty good example, too. Ron has worked very closely with me on this committee, and I've appreciated it, but I've noticed a little bit of, not by Ron, but a little bit of carping by occasionally people on both sides that it really can be very irritating from time to time, especially when we're trying to run a really good committee and do it in a way that all of us feel like we're heard. We may not all get what we want, but at least if we're heard and we have a good opportunity to present our cases, you know, that's about all a major committee can do. But this committee needs to do better work than it's been doing. And I intend to see that it does. And I hope it's bipartisan. But to be bipartisan, we both got to choke back some of the things that we think are necessary partisan things. And I think we can do that, but I haven't seen it so far. This has been a good hearing today, and I really appreciate those who have appeared before us and those who have committed the time and effort to this. And we'll just recess until tomorrow morning, starting at 9 a.m. And I hope people will be here ready to work, and let's hope we can get this work done so that we can move ahead. We're never going to agree on everything. We all know that. We're two different parties. We have different philosophies and different approaches, but we can be civil and we can do things that hopefully are open-minded enough to accommodate some of our colleagues' ideas as well on both sides. So with that, we'll recess until tomorrow at 9 a.m. Is that okay?
Yeah, you got to go vote.